Imagine walking into your own home and finding a child, not playing, not laughing, but sobbing as he digs through bags of trash. His tiny hands are trembling, his face streaked with tears, searching desperately for something the world had already decided wasn't worth keeping. This wasn't just any child. He was the son of a housekeeper, a boy who had already learned far too young what it meant to be dismissed, overlooked, and humiliated. What could drive a 9-year-old to claw through garbage like it held the last piece of hope? And why did the discovery leave a wealthy man, someone who had everything, shaken to his core? Because behind those torn papers and broken dreams lay a truth so cruel, it would expose a system built to keep kids like him down. Will you be ready to hear it? Michael Turner had spent most of his life chasing success. At 54, the millionaire had built his fortune through decades of long nights, relentless work, and a sharp business mind. He lived in a spacious home on the edge of the city, the kind of place that looked like everything was perfectly under control. Expensive cars in the driveway, a spotless lawn, and every detail managed with precision. From the outside, Michael's life appeared untouchable: wealth, security, and the respect of his peers. Yet for all his comfort, he was a man who preferred routine. Each day unfolded with quiet predictability. A morning jog, business meetings, evenings at home with a glass of wine, and the hum of classical music in the background. To most, this was the picture of a man who had it all. What Michael didn't realize, however, was that his carefully ordered world was about to be disrupted in a way money could never prepare him for. At the heart of Michael's household was Elena, his longtime housekeeper. She was steady, reliable, and carried herself with a quiet dignity. She worked tirelessly, balancing her duties in Michael's home with raising her 9-year-old son, Daniel. To Michael, they were simply part of the rhythm of the house. Always there, always dependable, never demanding much. He noticed Daniel's polite greetings, the way the boy carried his schoolbooks tightly under his arm, but he rarely thought beyond those small glimpses. Daniel was just a child, one of countless others trying to make their way in the world. But beneath the surface, Daniel's life was anything but ordinary. His mother juggled multiple jobs to keep him in school, determined that he would have opportunities she never had. Daniel himself carried a spark, curiosity, intelligence, and a hunger to learn that set him apart. Teachers often praised his ideas, though not all adults saw his gifts the same way. While Michael went about his daily routines, an unseen struggle was taking shape in the shadows of Daniel's school, a place meant to nurture potential but too often poisoned by bias. The night everything began seemed like any other. Michael returned home in his sleek Mercedes, tired but content, expecting the usual calm. He wasn't prepared for the sound that greeted him as he stepped inside. A low, muffled sobbing that carried down the hallway. It was faint, almost easy to ignore, but something about it pulled him forward. The house that usually echoed with silence now held the sound of heartbreak. He followed the noise until he reached the laundry room. What he saw stopped him cold. Daniel, small and fragile in the dim light, was surrounded by ripped open trash bags. His hands moved frantically, tossing aside crumpled papers, broken objects, and scraps of waste. Tears streamed down his face as he searched with a desperation no child should ever know. Michael froze, unsure at first whether to interrupt, unsure even of what he was looking at. In that moment, the polished life of a millionaire collided with a reality he had never fully seen before. A child digging through garbage inside his own home. It was unthinkable. But more than the image itself, it was the weight of Daniel's pain that shook him. This wasn't about hunger or toys. It was about something deeper, something Michael could sense but not yet name. He stood there, trying to piece together what could have driven a 9-year-old to tears and trash bags. Why was he here, in the middle of the night, searching like his life depended on it? What had been lost or taken from him? Michael didn't yet know that the answer would unravel not only Daniel's world, but also his own. Because the sobs in that laundry room weren't just the cries of a child. They were the sound of injustice, quietly waiting to be uncovered. And once Michael stepped forward, once he asked the questions that demanded answers, there would be no turning back. Michael couldn't shake the image of Daniel digging through trash bags. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, he sat in his study replaying it in his mind. Something about the boy's desperation gnawed at him. The next morning, he asked Elena carefully what had happened, but her weary smile and soft reassurance, "Sometimes life just isn't fair," left more questions than answers. Michael wasn't satisfied. He needed to know the truth. It came from Daniel himself in halting words, the kind no child should ever have to speak. His science project, a model powered by solar energy that he had worked on for weeks, had been thrown away. Alongside it went old photos of his mother he had kept taped inside his binder, reminders of where he came from. All of it had been dumped into the trash by the school principal. Not only dumped but mocked, dismissed in front of the entire class as worthless junk. Michael felt his chest tighten as Daniel described Principal Harris's words. "Projects like this look like they came from the slums. Kids like you should stick to small dreams." It wasn't just criticism. It was humiliation, meant to crush a child in front of his peers. Daniel's tears hadn't been about scraps of paper or broken cardboard. They were about dignity ripped away, hope reduced to garbage. For the first time, Michael saw the fragile line between privilege and prejudice drawn inside the walls of a school. That night, instead of his usual evening routines, he sat at his desk reviewing Daniel's school records. The boy was a straight-A student, praised for his creativity and consistency. Yet in the notes section, Harris had scribbled comments like, "should keep realistic expectations," and "not likely to adapt to advanced programs." Michael's anger grew with each page. He had built his empire by pushing past limits, yet here was a child being told to shrink his own dreams. The following day, Michael requested a meeting with Principal Harris. He expected defensiveness, maybe excuses. What he got instead was something far darker. Harris leaned back in his chair, blunt and unrepentant. "Scholarship kids," he said, "could never compete with the children of doctors and engineers. They didn't have the background, the polish, the right kind of upbringing." Harris insisted it was kinder to push them toward realistic futures, blue-collar jobs, modest trades. Michael listened in disbelief as Harris spoke, his words cold and calculated. Quietly, he turned on his phone recorder and captured every sentence. When Michael left that office, he knew this wasn't about one science project. It was about a system quietly stacked against children like Daniel. But before he could act, the situation worsened. Days later, Elena called him in tears. Daniel had been accused of stealing lab equipment from the school and was expelled on the spot. Michael rushed over, finding Daniel curled in his bed, his small voice breaking as he explained. Harris had told him kids from his background were naturally dishonest, that it was better if he confessed, even if he hadn't done anything. The accusation wasn't about theft. It was about branding him as untrustworthy, unworthy of belonging. Michael's fury burned. He had seen greed in business, but this was cruelty dressed as authority. And Daniel wasn't the only target. Other stories began to surface. A bright girl named Sophia had been told to stick to cooking instead of entering an academic contest. Marcus, a talented artist, had been barred from submitting work to the annual art show. Each example pointed back to Harris, a gatekeeper of opportunities, choosing who deserved to shine and who should be pushed back into the shadows. It was no longer a single child's struggle. It was a pattern, a system of quiet discrimination designed to keep certain kids in their place. Michael knew he couldn't stand by. He launched a plan with 3 deliberate steps. First, he brought in top lawyers who specialized in educational rights, determined to build a case strong enough to challenge Harris directly. Second, he reached out to Rachel Kim, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in schools. Third, he hired digital experts to comb through 5 years of the school's records, looking for patterns, hidden donations, and evidence of bias. The results were damning. Harris had consistently discriminated against scholarship students, marking them as troublemakers or discouraging their ambitions. Even worse, documents showed he had accepted donations from wealthy families, protecting their children from competition in science fairs, art contests, and scholarships. Behind every closed door, he had been quietly bending the future to favor privilege. Michael knew the evidence was powerful, but exposure came with risks. Harris had influence, connections, and supporters who benefited from his system. Going public meant inviting scrutiny, backlash, and a battle that could drag on for months. Yet the image of Daniel, small and broken in the laundry room, left Michael no choice. The stage was set for a confrontation bigger than he ever imagined. Parents would demand answers, lawyers would present evidence, and the truth of Harris's actions would echo far beyond the walls of that school. But Michael also knew one thing: corruption rarely collapses quietly. Harris would fight, clawing to protect his reputation, and Daniel's name would be dragged through the storm before the dust could settle. The question was no longer whether Michael would act. It was whether he could withstand the firestorm that was about to come. And when the first blow landed, no one in that community would ever see the school or its leader the same way again. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and by the time Michael arrived, the school's courtyard was already packed. Parents clustered in tight groups, reporters balanced cameras on tripods, and the low hum of conversation carried the weight of anticipation. At the center sat Principal Harris, expression stiff and unyielding, flanked by a few loyal staff members. To anyone passing by, it looked like a simple school meeting. But for those who knew, this was a reckoning. Michael felt the eyes on him as he walked in with Elena and Daniel at his side. The boy clutched his mother's hand, pale but steady, his small frame swallowed by the crowd. He had been branded a thief, mocked as worthless, discarded like trash. Tonight, his voice would be heard. Michael reminded himself of that as he passed the rows of chairs and took his place near the front. The lawyers opened the proceedings with a calm explanation, but the calm didn't last long. Within minutes, recordings filled the air. Harris's voice, cold and dismissive, echoed through the speakers. Kids like Daniel should accept their place in life. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Parents leaned forward, faces hardening as more words played. Too much kindness is harmful for children like him. The mask of authority Harris wore began to crack. He shifted in his chair, lips pressed thin, eyes darting toward the exits as if calculating escape routes. But the evidence kept coming. Documents projected on the screen showed donation trails from wealthy families. Notes in his handwriting discouraged scholarship students from pursuing advanced programs. Year after year, the same patterns emerged. Discrimination woven into policy, cloaked in authority. For the first time, the hidden lines were visible to everyone. And then came the moment no one expected. Elena stood, her voice, trembling but fierce, cut through the air. She recounted the nights she had worked multiple jobs just to keep her son in school. She spoke of Daniel's endless curiosity, his love for building, and the pride he took in his project, until Harris ripped it away. Every word landed like a strike, stripping Harris of his shield. But it was Daniel who delivered the final blow. The boy stepped forward, his small voice carrying louder than anyone thought possible. He looked Harris in the eye and asked, "Why did you call me a thief? Why did you say kids like me are no good?" The silence was deafening. Harris opened his mouth, then closed it. No excuse came. No justification could mask the truth in that moment. The power he held, the authority he used to crush children, dissolved under the gaze of a boy who refused to break. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and murmurs turned into outrage. Parents shouted questions. How many other children had been silenced? How much talent had been wasted under Harris's reign? The board members, who had once leaned comfortably on Harris's record, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. The lawyers delivered the final piece. A report from investigators confirming Harris had not only discriminated but also funneled opportunities away from deserving students in exchange for donations. The weight of the truth was crushing. By the time the evidence was finished, the crowd's outrage had boiled into something uncontainable. Harris's face was pale, his composure gone. He muttered about misunderstandings, about context. But the crowd was no longer listening. Parents demanded his resignation on the spot. The board announced an immediate suspension, pending permanent removal. His career, his reputation, everything he had built on fear and favoritism, was collapsing before his eyes. But the true climax wasn't Harris's downfall. It was Daniel's defiance. The boy who had been forced to dig through trash now stood in front of hundreds, unafraid, demanding answers. His questions still hung in the air, echoing louder than any recording, more powerful than any document. Why did you call me a thief? Why did you say kids like me are no good? There was no answer because the truth had already been revealed. The courtyard erupted in voices, some angry, some relieved, all changed. And in that chaos, as Harris was escorted away, Daniel leaned into his mother's side, his face still streaked with the weight of everything he had endured. Michael looked at him then, not as a servant's child, not as a boy dismissed by authority, but as a fighter who had forced an entire community to confront what it had ignored for too long. The night closed with Harris stripped of power, his name already spreading across headlines. Yet beneath the noise, one question lingered, heavier than all the rest. If a single boy had to suffer this much before the truth was seen, how many others had already been broken in silence? In the weeks that followed the hearing, the fallout was swift. Principal Harris was removed from his position, his teaching license revoked, and the weight of public shame left him with few options. A man who once ruled a school with authority and arrogance now stood behind the counter of a small store, invisible to the very families he once controlled. For some, this was justice. But for Michael, Elena, and Daniel, justice meant more than the fall of one person. It meant building something stronger in its place. Michael announced the creation of the Turner Education Foundation, a scholarship program designed to lift children from every background, giving them the opportunities that prejudice had once tried to take away. Elena, once confined to the quiet role of housekeeper, became its executive director. For the first time in years, her hands were not just cleaning and serving, but shaping futures. Her voice, once silenced, now carries weight in boardrooms and classrooms alike. And Daniel, he transformed. 6 months later, he entered the state science fair with a project he had rebuilt from scratch. A low-cost solar energy system that could power entire households in underserved communities. His design not only impressed the judges, but it also won first place. Scholarship offers from 3 universities arrived soon after. On stage, beneath bright lights, Daniel held his award high. His voice trembled, but his words carried across the room. He dedicated the project to his mother, who had sacrificed everything to keep him in school, and to Mr. Turner, who had reminded him that dreams have no color, no class, no boundaries. The audience rose to its feet, applause filling the air. For once, Daniel's tears were not of humiliation or grief, but of triumph. But the impact of this story stretched beyond one boy, one family, or one school. The investigation uncovered patterns of bias across the district, sparking reforms and new oversight measures. Parents became more vigilant, demanding transparency in classrooms. Journalists carried the story nationwide, igniting conversations about how subtle prejudice in schools can shape a child's entire future. And yet, beneath the victory, a sobering truth remained. For every Daniel who found an ally, how many children had been quietly pushed aside, their dreams labeled unrealistic, their talents dismissed? How many voices had been silenced before they ever had the chance to be heard? Michael often reflected on the night he found Daniel crying in the laundry room, surrounded by trash bags. It was the image that had started everything. A child searching for the pieces of his stolen dream, discarded by someone who should have been nurturing it. That memory reminded him, and everyone who heard this story, that racism doesn't always appear in grand, obvious gestures. Sometimes it hides in paperwork, in lowered expectations, in the quiet dismissal of a child's potential. Daniel himself put it best when he looked up at Michael one evening and said, "She taught me something by trying to break me. The people who try to push you down are usually the ones afraid of your light." That light was no longer hidden. It burned brighter than ever, not just for Daniel, but for dozens of other children now thriving under the foundation's support. Each success became a reminder that dreams, when nurtured, can defy every barrier. As the story closed, the question shifted from Daniel's survival to our own responsibility. How often do we look away when a child is quietly being pushed aside? How often do we accept unfairness as the way things are instead of challenging it? Because the truth is this: greatness is never defined by address, skin color, or last name. It is defined by courage, by persistence, and by the refusal to let others decide the size of your dreams. So the next time you hear of a child being dismissed, mocked, or underestimated, ask yourself, will you stay silent, or will you stand up and prove that every dream deserves to shine? What do you think about Michael's decision to stand up for Daniel? Do you believe one person can truly change a system stacked against so many? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how the story spoke to you. And if this journey moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like this to light, and together we can keep the conversation going.